This is a UNCG Pedagogical Poetry Society video, and I'm Leslie Knight. In today's video, we'll be talking about dramatic monologues. The name dramatic monologue implies that there's something theatrical about this type of poetry, and elements of the form can be seen as far back as the theater of the ancient Greeks. However, the dramatic monologue form as we recognize it today was invented in the Victorian era by poets like Robert Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and the Rossetti siblings. Dramatic monologues can be used to write about any subject that the poet wishes. However, while the poem's content is up for grabs, there are a few key traits that define the genre. Dramatic monologues are written from the perspective of a single speaker, and this speaker is a completely different person from the poet. While the distinction between the poet and the speaker of a poem is present in any poetic form, in a dramatic monologue the separation is especially important. The poet creates a character who is the poem's speaker, and this character speaks for the duration of the poem without interruption, typically addressing a listener who is not the reader. This is the key difference between a standard monologue and a dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologues have a specific, understood, or implied audience, while a standard monologue doesn't and can be taken to address anyone. Dramatic monologues typically are trying to accomplish two things. First, they offer up some kind of narrative component, though that story-like element of the poem is typically highly concentrated. Secondly, these types of poems focus on revealing something about the speaker and offering psychological insight into their character. This may mean that the poem deals with the speaker's relationships, shows something about their temperament, reveals their motives, or offers any other kind of insight into what makes this speaker who they are. This is the main factor distinguishing a dramatic monologue from a narrative poem, as narrative poems are more concerned with plot than with the psychology of characters involved, while psychological depth is the main goal of the dramatic monologue. The dramatic monologue as a form doesn't have a designated rhyme scheme unique to the genre. A poet may choose to include a rhyme scheme if they want, but this is not a requirement of the form. And this adaptability to any sort of rhyme scheme, or to having no rhyme scheme at all, allows the poet a lot of room to play with the way that the poem sounds, and to make stylistic choices that affect how the poem's reader perceives the poem's speaker. So just to recap, dramatic monologues are poems that focus on offering psychological insight into the poem's speaker, who is a character created by and separate from the poet. This speaker speaks for the duration of the poem uninterrupted, addressing an imagined audience that is separate from the poem's reader. In the next portion of this video, I'll be talking about some teaching strategies that you can use in your classroom to teach dramatic monologues, as well as looking at one specific example of dramatic monologue from Robert Browning, who's well known for his dramatic monologues. So stay tuned for the next section of the video for that. Now that we have a bit of background on what dramatic monologues are and what they do, we can talk a bit more about some examples of dramatic monologues and how we can teach them effectively. It's always a good idea to read aloud any poem that you're teaching a lesson or a sequence of lessons on, but with dramatic monologues, this strategy is especially important. Dramatic monologues are speeches. They are meant to be read aloud, and often the psychological depths of the speaker that the poet is probing become much clearer and more impactful when a reader is able to hear the poem aloud. With some more popular poems in the form, you can find videos online of famous actors or writers reading the poem aloud. On the other hand, if you have a more extroverted class, have students give reading the poem aloud a try. Reading the poem aloud opens up several possibilities to talk about voice, diction, rhyme if the poem has a rhyme scheme, tone, and other aspects of the poem that are always present, but become especially noticeable when the poem can be both heard and read, as opposed to only being on the page. With longer dramatic monologues, like the example we'll be looking at in a few moments, it can also be helpful to break the poem into chunks. This strategy focuses on helping students track the narrative elements of the poem through its movements, and encourages them to focus on specific details that offer insight into the character of the poem's speaker. For an introductory class, you as the instructor might offer the students an already broken up version of the poem and ask them to complete specific tasks,
such as paraphrasing each chunk or exploring specific lines in these sections and making a determination about what those lines reveal about the speaker, their motives, or their personality. In later class sessions, once students are more comfortable with the form, you could also ask students either as a class, in small groups, or individually to break the poem into sections themselves. This exercise helps students think through in a more concrete way how the poet guides the reader through the poem and helps them track development of plot and development of the speaker's character over the course of the text, as well as giving them some practice with honing in on specific details and lines and drawing insights out of those details. So to illustrate this particular strategy, let's take a look at Robert Browning's poem, My Last Duchess. Browning's poem is generally accepted to be based on the life of the Duke of Ferrara, specifically dealing with the mysterious and suspicious death of his late wife at 17 years old. To offer a quick paraphrase of what the poem is about, the poem's speaker, who's understood to be the Duke of Ferrara, is speaking with an emissary visiting to arrange a new marriage for the Duke, and invites this emissary to examine a portrait of his recently deceased wife, who he refers to throughout the poem as My Last Duchess. The Duke describes their marriage, particularly his disapproval of and dissatisfaction with his wife and some of her behaviors during their marriage. The speaker then details specific behaviors of the late Duchess that made him angry and reveals to the emissary his increasingly controlling behavior throughout the poem and throughout their marriage. The speaker goes on to reiterate that the Duchess is no longer alive, and the poem insinuates that her death was not entirely natural. The Duke goes on to invite the emissary to join him downstairs, away from this portrait, to further discuss this prospective new marriage that the emissary has offered. So My Last Duchess is the quintessential dramatic monologue. Even though its language is older and can present a bit of a challenge for students, it's also one of the clearest examples of several of the traits we discussed in the first section of this video that define what a dramatic monologue is. There's a clear implied audience in this poem that a speaker is addressing, and it is immediately obvious that the speaker is also not a poet. The poem depicts a situation that Browning himself did not experience, but is able to write about through this specific form, and is able to deal with topics that his readers would have found pressing through this form, including gender roles and the complexities of navigating marriage, especially for women. This poem is also one that utilizes a fairly standard rhyme and metrical scheme, with most of the poem written in iambic pentameter and only a few lines breaking with this scheme for emphasis. These lines are a great opportunity to look in more detail at scansion and to discuss as a class how meter and rhyme can be used to draw a reader's attention to specific lines or ideas that the poet wants to emphasize. This poem is a super fun one to read aloud. It's a little bit on the long side, so I'm not going to do that in this particular video, but there are some great recordings online of accomplished actors reading through the poem. The Duke's controlling attitude and nearly psychopathic behavior towards his late wife becomes immediately more obvious when the poem is read aloud, with all the natural inflections of voice adding to Browning's verse. My Last Duchess is also a great poem for trying out the chunking method that I just discussed, which is something that I've done here. As the poem has a discernible sort of 5-act structure, almost like a drama or a Shakespearean play. As its plot unfolds and as increasingly concerning layers of the Duke's psychology and fixation are revealed. In the example you see on your screen right now, I've chunked the poem together by its narrative movement, but you might ask students to group the lines together based on what the reader learns about the Duke and the revelations that we have about his character's psychology. One of my favorite things to do when working with dramatic monologues in the classroom is also to have students draft their own monologues. This may mean that they draft something completely original, or you might open up the option to rewrite a dramatic monologue that the class has read from the perspective of another character. For example, if your class was working with My Last Duchess, you might open up the option for students to be able to rewrite this dramatic monologue from the perspective of the emissary that the Duke is speaking to. Or if you wanted to go a little bit more of a spooky route, even the Last Duchess's ghost. This exercise encourages students to practice creating a character to be the speaker of their poem in the same way that poets studied in class have in their own poems, as well as encourages them to think more intentionally about how to structure a poem in such a way to gradually reveal characteristics of the speaker to the poem's reader. The flexibility of this assignment allows students to be as creative as they want, or to stick close to the forms that they've already seen in class if they aren't completely comfortable with the dramatic monologue form on their own yet. Having the class share their monologues with one another also opens up great possibilities for conversation about crafting a narrative, creating a speaker, imagining an audience, and other formal aspects of the poems, as well as the thematic elements included by students in their work. In the description box below this video, you can find a few other suggestions for dramatic monologues that may be useful for classroom use, or if you and your students would just like more examples of what the form could look like in the hands of other poets. Thank you so much for watching this UNCG Pedagogical Poetry Society video. We hope you enjoyed it and found something helpful in it for your classroom use. Please feel free to explore our channel for more videos about other poetry genres and suggestions for using them in your classroom, and happy teaching.